Oh my God, Tucker, get out of my face. Oh. Oh shit. Good. Draw back. Yes. Huh. Good.
I unfortunately have checked. And that's your little bit of meat to try.
You should try it.
There we go.
Easy.
Hello.
Well, good.
This is funny. I just started a Zoom session. I've been using Zoom for 2 or 3 years, but I bought a new Microsoft Surface tablet. I think what my issue is not it. I just don't know what I'm doing with Zoom, but I had a gallery view where it showed me and one other student that has chimed in so far. The class officially doesn't start for a few minutes. I don't know how to get back to that gallery view. Right now, I can only see the student's video. I can't see my own image. Not there, not there. Now I went to a share with PowerPoint. I went to a share with whiteboard, and that may be the problem. But I can't get that little gallery. Go ahead.
Yes, so you are sharing with those, go back to your previous, so
How?
stop sharing, so you don't know what you're
Now, if I hit stop, all right, now, this is a large class, 30-something students that will be coming in. I don't want to kill the meeting. If I hit stop share, that does not kill the meeting, right? Okay. Bingo. Why didn't I think of that? That's great. Great. Thank you very much.
Separated, locked down.
Yep, I'm there. You have a great day, and I'll continue with my class. Bye-bye. Caleb, you there?
Should be made out of that.
I am. I'm just shopping
Hey,
at
good
Starbucks, so
evening.
it might be a little bit loud, so I'll stay muted.
Don't worry about it. Actually, Sarah Waters was the first to enter, but she's not there. If you look, you just see her chair, right? In front
Yeah.
of curtains. There's a ton of noise coming from her end. I tell you what, I'm nervous about this meeting. Hey, Sarah.
Hey, sorry, I'm finishing dinner with my husband and son. Be there in just a few minutes.
Go right ahead, take your time.
Thank you, sir.
This is I finally got a Microsoft Surface. I love it. But I'm nervous about using it. And the funny thing is the camera, I can't use the one that comes with it. I had to use an external camera. I've got it. I was trying to position it where it's not so close up on my face, and it made me think of an old movie. You guys, this is before you were born, but Dustin Hoffman had a hilarious movie called Tootsie. He was an out-of-work actor. He dressed up and pretended to be this old woman, and he got on a soap. Now, at one point, the director says to the cameraman, "I'd like you to back up a little bit to make her look more attractive." And the cameraman says, "How do you feel about Cleveland?" That's kind of where I am now. I can't get this camera far enough away from me to keep from showing all the imperfections. Sorry about that. It was the only thing I could think of at the moment to say. How you guys doing?
I'm doing well, doing well.
Cool. That's great. It's warm here. This looks like a t-shirt. It's not. I would tell you it's my lucky shirt, but it's not. I don't have such a thing. But it's nicer than a t-shirt. It's got pockets and stuff. So I don't want to violate any dress code or show disrespect to my class. Although I do think it's good for it to be casual. Far side chat.
Wouldn't be violating any dress code unless it said Mississippi State on it.
Oh, easy now, easy.
Oh, here we go. Here we go.
You know that was a perfect opportunity.
Right.
Listen, our associate pastor used to be, the one we used to have was a rabid State fan. I mean, even when he would pinch hit for the pastor, he would wear Mississippi State garb, you know?
I give state grief, but that was actually why I wasn't able to attend last week, was because I was coming back from Starkville doing some work up there.
I got my bachelor's and MBA at Starkville. So I've got 2 Mississippi State diplomas hanging on my wall. I finally went to the University of Arkansas for my doctorate, but yeah, my wife is the oldest of 4 sisters. Between the sisters and their husbands, we have 10 state degrees.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, I know. Weird, huh? Well, what time do you guys have? I have like 5 after 7.
I've got 2 till.
2 till, yeah.
Fix that. There we go. Hey, Shannon, good evening.
Good evening, how are you?
We'll see. Listen, if this whole meeting crashes and burns, I apologize in advance. I've got a new toy, and it's awkward to kind of, I'm trying to get acclimated to it, using a stylus instead of a mouse. Crystal, good evening. Sarah, good evening.
Good
How
evening.
you guys doing?
Doing well. How are you?
I'll tell you after this meeting is over.
Hey, I've got a question in the spirit of small talk that could actually have something to do with our lesson tonight.
All right.
So Fox Business was on at the gym this morning, and they were just talking about the S&P and all the indices being
Right.
down pretty much down the amount that they had gained in 2020 because of the coronavirus. So
That's all.
how does
Trade.
just something like that affect those
Yeah,
indices?
I thought the same thing, Trey. They're concerned that, and hey, that's something you'll have to ask someone smarter than me, but I know it from what little I could read, they're concerned it'll disrupt trade in some fashion. But that's a good question.
I'll see if I can't find out and report back.
Cool. There might be something in my my Wall Street Journal subscription. They send out something each week called Wall Street Journal Weekly, and they pull 5 major articles that are really designed to be worked into the classrooms. And I actually posted one of those just for grins earlier, not requiring you to read it, not worrying about it, but they may pull something up on that. That would be an interesting connection to make. It's really, Caleb, your question's a really good one. It is. Lori?
Yes, sir.
Please tell me you're not driving while you're in this class.
I am a passenger.
Okay. You know, one of the students I had last spring had 3 little kids. And the only way he could join in the meeting was to get in the garage and get in his car and he'd get on his phone. But I thought that was weird.
I luckily have a bonus room that I can go to at times.
Yeah. Caitlin and Ashley, good evening.
Hello.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'll wait a couple of minutes just to see if somebody else comes in.
I don't guess I really have to since this thing is being recorded. You guys ready to start?
Yeah, I got my coffee now. Let's go.
Sure,
Oh.
let's do it.
I wish I could drink coffee at night. It keeps me up at night. But I love the taste of coffee. All right. This week we're looking at valuation, and what you're going to find is I've got one set of slides that pull in two chapters. Chapter 7 is on stock valuation. You know, how do we estimate the value of a share of stock? But in the middle of it, we revert back to chapter 2 to pick up a concept called free cash flow that the more important valuation model in chapter 7 then uses. So what I'm trying to say is this actually involves two chapters, 7 and 2. And before I get started with that, let me mention something just for grins. There is something called the EMH, Efficient Markets Hypothesis. If you ever take investments, you'll be introduced to it. Now, the reason I bring it up, it is a school of thought that says if you perform security analysis, you're wasting your time. The true value, what we're after is something called intrinsic value. Think of it as the true value of share of stock. Well, according to the efficient markets hypothesis, whatever the price of the stock in the market is at the time, that is its true value. So if you fully subscribe to the efficient markets hypothesis, you would say chapter 7 is a total waste of time. Just wanted to point that out. What we're trying to do is to determine what we think a share of stock is really worth. And implied in that is that we think we can come up with a value different from the market price of the stock. You know, if we perform our little analysis with one of these models and we come up with a value for a stock of $22 a share, and we look in the market and it's trading at $17 a share, we would say it's undervalued and we'd buy it. Or if it's trading for $30 a share, we would say it's overvalued. And if we own it, we'd sell it. We wouldn't buy it. And there is also something called shorting a stock, something else you'll pick up if you ever take investments. Believe it or not, it's a way to make a profit if the stock price goes down. But, all right, back to the main thing we're after tonight. I had to show you this picture. I thought you'd get a kick out of this. Recognize anybody? Such as Bill Gates. Can you guys see this picture? Somebody say you can see.
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, we see it. Sorry.
No, this was Microsoft back in '78 when they first started. Would you have wanted to put your money into a company run by guys and gals that look like this? It was a point. Okay. We are going to look primarily at two models. One is called the dividend model. And the more important model, the one your case is built around, is the corporate valuation model. There was a time, a long time ago, when companies had to pay dividends to get investors to invest. It was a demonstration of financial strength. We have long left that behind, but the dividend model, as it's called, it's based on dividends, is an important part of the literature. So, I would be doing a poor job if I didn't at least expose you to it. A third method of valuing stocks using what's called price multiples is folly. It's misused more than properly used. Okay, so to our first model, the dividend model. Its philosophy is this: if you buy a share of stock and hold it forever, the only cash flows you're going to get are going to be the dividends it pays. So it argues that the value of a share of stock now, the subscript is a time subscript. P sub 0 would mean now. And the little funny hat simply means estimate. Our estimate of the value of a share of stock, if you use a dividend model, is we take all the future dividends and discount them back to the present. And how are dividends actually paid for stocks that pay dividends? Quarterly. Your author treats them, and I will too, as if they're paid annually. On the face of it, it looks like we're just trying to make things simpler, and it does. But later in the course, you'll learn that this actually corrects a bias. It actually ends up leading to a model that's more accurate. Now, back in your time value of money class, if you were told to find the present value of some future cash flow, and you did it algebraically, you take that future cash flow and divide by 1 plus your discount rate raised to the t. Let me see if I can find a calculator. Give you an example. For instance, what if we want to know the present value of $500 received, I don't know, 6 years from now? And our discount rate is, I don't know, 10%. Anytime you find the present value of something, you apply a discount rate. It's supposedly your time value of money. So using this model, we take that 500, divide by 1 plus our discount rate, which needs to be in decimal form. So 10% in decimal form is what? 0.10?
1.
Yep. And then we'd raise it to the t, in this case, 6. And we would get $373.63. See if I can fix something without blowing everything up. Now, with a dividend model, how many dividends does a stock pay in the future? You know, if you're looking at a bond, it'll pay interest until the bond matures, but when does a stock mature?
In theory, never.
In theory, never. Perfect answer. In theory, never. So if we wanted to find the present value of all future dividends, this would be the model we'd be looking at. What's the problem with this approach? How many terms would we have?
Infinity.
An infinite number. Graphically, what we'd be trying to do is just discount all the future dividends back to the present. And I'm using the symbol, and I should have mentioned that on the prior slide. R sub S is your author's symbol for the stockholder's required rate of return. If you're looking at investing in Microsoft and you want a 10% rate of return, or you don't want to invest in it, that would be R sub S. Now, if we can assume, and don't worry, I'm not going off the deep end with math. Please relax on that. But if we assume that dividends could grow at a constant rate, let's say G, that would mean, for example, if the dividend for the year just ended was $2 and the growth rate was 5%, then the dividend in year one would be that $2 times 1 plus 5%. Sorry about those funny lines that are coming out, but that would be 210. That would be like with your salary if you got a 5% raise every year. Only we're assuming we're applying it to stocks. And the dividend in the following year would be the prior year's dividend times 1 plus G again. If you go ahead and expand this out, the equation gets even uglier. And, but if you bring in a mathematician, they would point at that and say, that's a mathematical power series, but it's a well-behaved power series. That mess of equations on the right reduces down to this simple ratio. D1 over R sub S minus G. The payment in the coming year, the dividend in the coming year, D1, divided by the stockholder's required rate of return, R sub S, minus the expected growth rate in dividends, G. If you ever go to court for lost wages, this is what they use. Now they tweak it some, but this still gives you the present value of a future set of payments that go forever and grow at a constant rate G. If G is 5%, each payment's 5% bigger than the last one. So if we apply this, my point is this simple little ratio is a pretty sophisticated present value function. Now, if we try to apply it to a company, I'm sorry about my minions, but I get bored. Let's say we're looking at the Cobb Corporation. Stockholders, based on Cobb's risk, think they should get a 15% rate of return. The annual dividend paid for the year just ended, if today's January 1, this was paid yesterday, is $2, D0. The dividend for the year just ended is $2. If we buy the stock now, we miss that $2 payment. We just miss it. But if we assume they grow at a constant rate of 5%, then the intrinsic value of the Cobb stock could be found by our model. First, we get D1, which is the numerator, and then divide out. If you'll notice, the stockholders' required rate of return and the growth rate in dividends is in decimal form. Now, this, if we use the dividend model, this is what we would think of as the true value of the stock. This is what we think it's worth, its intrinsic value. Now, if we trust this dividend model, if we think it's appropriate for this particular Cobb stock, and we look in the market, if the price is less than $21, we'd think, hey, it's a steal, we'll buy it. If the market price of the stock is over 21, we would think it's overvalued. If we owned it, we'd probably go ahead and sell it. You with me so far on this?
Yes, sir.
Now, you can also rearrange this formula and determine what your expected rate of return would be for some given price. What if we could buy the stock for $15? What would be our expected rate of return? If you notice, because our success is in decimal form in the model, your answer comes out in decimal form. And our expected rate of return would be 19%. Just for grins, what if I had, what if I had a stock, why not call it this? Let's say Zoom Corporation paid a dividend in the year just ended of $1. Dividends are expected to grow at a, 8% rate indefinitely. So if you require a 15% rate of return, based on the stock's risk. The riskier the stock, the higher would be our required rate of return. If you require a 15% rate of return, what is the value of the stock? Well, using our dividend model, we'd say the estimated value of the stock would be, for D1, we'd want to take the dividend for the year just ended times 1 plus net growth rate. So $1 times 1.08 would give us $1.08. And that's what we plug into the model on the top. Our required rate of return is 15%, and our growth rate is 8%. So that would give us an estimated value of the stock It's not a nice round number, but I'm getting $15.43 per share. Now, if you could buy the stock for, I don't know, $12 per share. What is your expected rate of return? Based on the dividend model. Well, using that model, rearranged to solve for R sub S, we'd still have that dividend of what, $1.08? But we'd now be looking at a price of $12, an expected growth rate of 8%. So funny, came out even right on the nose. 17%. Note that if we paid $15.43 for the stock, that ought to give us a 15% rate of return. So if we could pay less for that stock, that ought to give us a higher rate of return. That makes sense. And of course, the 1543 would be what we think of as the intrinsic value, the true value, what we think the stock's really worth. You're so quiet, and I don't have my gallery view, but is this making sense to you?
It is. I was just finishing copying it down a little bit.
My heart skipped a beat when there was that pause between I asked it that question, and Caitlin, was that you responding?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right. Any questions before I clear this?
So pretty much each time, sorry. So pretty
It's
much
going
each
to be in the
time,
recording anyway.
yeah. Pretty much each time when we work this, we need to start by finding D1, then plug in the D1 value. So it's pretty much a two-step process or two equations we're working with.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. If you wanted to use this for preferred stock, preferred stock's just like common stock, except the dividends don't get bigger. They never grow. Here's your common stock valuation model. So for preferred stock, we simply set the growth rate equal to 0. If you buy energy preferred stock, your dividends are going to be the same dollar amount quarter after quarter. So for the preferred stock model, we dispense with the times subscript for D because all the dividends are the same. And we drop the growth rate because it's 0. And that's what we use for preferred stock, according to the dividend model. So if we had Energy Corporation and it pays an 8% annual dividend based on a $100 par value or $8 annual dividend, and our required rate of return on this preferred stock is 10%, we'd say the stock is worth $80. Now, I'm just trying to give you a little warm-up preview of the thinking behind the dividend model. What's the problem with the dividend model? Could you apply it to a lot of the technology stocks today? No, because what? They don't pay dividends. Okay. Now we're going to go to the major model, the corporate valuation model, which is what you use for your case. But before we do that, we have to digress. We have to go back to chapter 2 to pick up a couple of concepts. The corporate valuation model is based on something called free cash flow, not dividends, free cash flow. Think of free cash flow as excess cash profit. It's cash profit that a company makes from operations above and beyond what it needs to hang on to reinvest, to support growth. The philosophy behind this is that a lot of the items that go into net income aren't recurring items. So at the heart of this model is the idea to focus on recurring profit. Now, if you look at the next couple of slides, those are the financial statements we're going to use for our company tonight. And I don't even know, MD Corporation. I just made up a name. There are the balance sheets for the last 2 years, the income statements. So now we need to determine, since the corporate valuation model focuses on free cash flow, we need to figure out how we come up with it. We start with something called net operating working capital. Now, back in an earlier course, you were taught that working capital is simply current assets minus current liabilities. But to get net operating working capital, we kick out the interest-bearing current assets and the interest-bearing current liabilities. In current assets, the interest-bearing current asset is typically marketable securities, or today the more common way to describe that is to call that short-term investments. So if for, let's say 2020, if you look at our financial statements, current assets were 1,037. Marketable securities were 37. Current liabilities were 310. And notes payable, which is the interest-bearing current liability, is 110. We're still taking current assets minus current liabilities, but we're kicking out the interest-bearing current assets and the interest-bearing current liabilities. So for MD Corporation, we come up with a net operating working capital for 2020 of 800 mil. We then go on to define operating capital as net operating working capital plus net fixed assets. If you look on the balance sheet for 2020, you see that net fixed assets are 1,000. So our operating capital, $1.8 billion, or 1,800 million. This is what we assume our investment in operations is. Rather than looking at investment as total assets, we use this measure. It's considered our investment, our net investment in operations or operating assets. Your author uses operating capital and operating assets interchangeably. They mean the same thing. In our measure of profit is not net income. We use something called NOPAT. That stands for net operating profit after taxes. It's found by taking EBIT, which stands for earnings before interest expense and taxes. It's more commonly known as operating profit. Not just by this author. If you look in practitioner publications, EBIT stands for operating profit. Now, for our company, NOPAT, our after-tax profit from operations was 180 mil. We define free cash flow as NOPAT minus the change in operating capital over the prior year. Or by another name, our expansion in operating assets. Now, if we assume that the operating profit for the prior year was given as 1455 mil, then our free cash flow would be found by these figures. Basically, we would have earned 180 million in after-tax profit from operations, but undergone an expansion of 345 mil. So my first question to you is, did this company earn enough in profit from operations to pay for the expansion? Anybody?
No.
No. We fell short by 165 million. And this is the part that students have a little trouble coming to grips with. A negative free cash flow is not a bad thing. In fact, when companies really take off, Facebook, Google, when they start growing, they grow at such a fast rate, they expand so much that there's no way their current operating profit can cover their expansion needs. What does a negative free cash flow of 165 mil mean? It means the company had to go to outside financing sources to help pay for the expansion. It either had to borrow more money or sell more shares of stock. But it's not a bad thing, and it is typical of fast-growing companies. Now, of course, we hope eventually this turns positive. Are you with me on this so far?
Getting there.
Getting there. Okay. I know it's different. And I didn't put it in the slides for tonight, but I would like to show you one other thing. If we're going to go to the trouble to calculate NOPAT and operating capital, there's another measure that's related to this. It's called EVA, Economic Value Added. EVA. And it's calculated by a formula that looks a lot like free cash flow. You take NOPAT and subtract, and over here you do have operating capital, but you also have a term called WACC, weighted average cost of capital, which you guys have already run into. Now, let's suppose that MD's WACC in 2010 was, 2020, lost 10 years. Let's say it was, I don't know, 9%. If we calculate EVA for 2020, we take our NOPAT, which I think we already cranked that out to be 180, right? The cost of capital in decimal form would be 9%. And we had operating capital of 1,800. So if we go ahead and crank that out, coming up with 162 mil. And this is how you interpret this. The 180 mil was our actual after-tax operating profit. The 162 mil, where's my eraser? There we go, get that out of the way. Sorry, I'm being slow here. The 162 mil is what the market expected our operating profit to be. So you tell me, did the company fall short of market expectations or exceed them?
Exceeded them.
Exceeded them. What typically happens when analysts announce earnings, or a company announces what its earnings are, and they exceed what analysts were expecting? You know the name what they use for what analysts were expecting? Guidance. In this case, market guidance was 162 million. That's what all the analysts were saying operating profit ought to be after taxes. If they exceed it, what typically happens to the stock price?
It increases in value.
It goes up. If earnings were expected to be a certain level and then the company announces it exceeded that, that's good news, and the market reacts positively. It drives the stock price up. In this case, we'd be exceeding expectations by 18 million. Now, here's what's funny. If you want to learn more about this, just go to eva.com. Here's what's funny. I taught in an executive MBA program down in Mandeville, Louisiana for 2 or 3 years. And I had a small group of guys that were in management positions in companies. This is what's funny. They taught me EVA because they were evaluated by it. If their division or their company had a positive EVA, that means it exceeded expectations. And of course, for shareholders, typically the stock price would go up. Shareholder wealth would be increased. And when that happens, management would get a big bonus. Now, what if, picking another color here, what if the expected profit was 190 and the actual profit after-tax operating profit was only 180? Yeah. That was in share, wasn't it? Then we would have fallen 10 million short of expectations. What typically happens to the stock price if they announce profits and they're lower than what was expected? Stock price goes down. Remember, I told you that a negative free cash flow is not a bad thing. Well, a negative EVA is a bad thing. When a company has a negative EVA, typically stock prices drop with that. And of course, that diminishes shareholder wealth. And if management comes up with a negative EVA 2 or 3 years in a row, they end up having to look for a new job. All right, that was just a little side tour. Now let's go back. Do you have questions about it before I leave it?
Was this just kind of something to help add context to what we're studying, or should we expect to see this on more content or in the class?
It adds context to what we were studying. We were looking at NOPAT, we were looking at operating capital, and our primary purpose was to see how companies calculate free cash flow. But I thought you'd also like to know that it's also used, these concepts are used to evaluate management performance. It gets personal. It starts to affect the compensation for management and job security. Not all companies use it at all, but I was shocked at how many of my students were exposed to it by their company. All right, let's go back to our slides. Hello. There we go. So we looked at the dividend model. Then we took a little detour back to chapter 2 to see how we come up with free cash flow. And once again, think of free cash flow as excess cash profit, profit the company doesn't need. Now, in your dividend model, we did everything on a per share basis from start to finish. With the corporate valuation model, we start with aggregate values for the whole company. And only in our last step do we knock it down to a per share level. In the dividend model, the present value of future dividends was what we defined as the value of the stock. In the corporate valuation model, we define the value of operations as the present value of all future free cash flow. This will make sense to you in a minute. Right now, I love that word context. You don't have the context for this to make sense. So let's take a simple example. Let's say we've got a company, MD Corporation. Its free cash flow for the coming year is forecasted to be $450 million. That free cash flow is expected to grow at a 6% rate indefinitely. And our cost of capital is 24%. We use the same model we use for dividends to find the present value of future free cash flow. Because what we're looking for is the present value of a series of cash flows that grow at a constant rate and go forever. Only we label it a little bit differently. First of all, we define this as the value of the operating assets. And instead of dividends, of course, we're looking at free cash flow. We basically are saying the value of operating assets now is the free cash flow in the coming year divided by the cost of capital minus the growth rate in free cash flow. And also, our discount rate is not the stockholders' required rate of return or SBES. Instead, our discount rate's the cost of capital. Because free cash flow is a return on both debt and equity. So we use a weighted average required rate of return, the WACC. Now, for our company, if we plug in those values we were given, remember this is free cash flow in the coming year. In our problem, it was the end of 2020. So this was free cash flow for 2021. Our cost of capital was 24%. Our growth rate in free cash flow is 6%. And once again, these have to be in decimal form. And we find the present value of a series of free cash flow that are 450 in the coming year, grow at a 6% rate and go forever. When our discount rate is 24%, the value of all those future free cash flows, 2,500 mil. That's where you start with a corporate valuation model. You find the value of operating assets.
Just to double check, the growth rate and the discount rate, those are both from the current year, not from the future year, right?
Both. If we say we think the growth rate in free cash flow will be 6%, we believe it'll grow 6% every year in the future. Each year's free cash flow will be 6% bigger than the prior year's free cash flow.
That's common. Okay, what about the WACC? Does that come from the
WACC is our required rate of return based on the risk. We think that is an appropriate discount rate to apply to the future free cash flow.
Okay, so that's constant year to year as
It's
well.
constant, yeah.
Okay.
Now, next step, We run this through the balance sheet equation. We've estimated the value of operating assets. We run this through the so-called balance sheet equation and solve for the value of equity. And then the last step is we knock it down to per share. For example, let's say we look on the balance sheet for our company and short-term investments, which would also be non-operating assets. Think of it that way. Or 37 million. Our interest-bearing debt consists of notes payable and long-term debt. And the company has 50 million shares outstanding. Now, if you think of a balance sheet equation, you think assets are equal to liabilities plus equity, accounting 101. We divide our assets into two categories: operating assets and non-operating assets. And for liabilities, we've already factored out non-interest-bearing liabilities like accounts payable and accruals. When we came up with free cash flow, we used that to find the value of operating assets. But when we calculated free cash flow, we went ahead and deducted non-interest-bearing liabilities like accruals and accounts payable. Free cash flow was based on, in part, operating capital, which was based on net operating working capital. And we did deduct accruals and accounts payable when we came up with net operating working capital, which we used to find operating capital, which we used to find free cash flow. Since we've already accounted for accruals and accounts payable in the value of operations, the only debt we have to account for now is the interest-bearing debt. And again, this will be notes payable and long-term debt. You know, bond debt. So assets, two categories, operating and non-operating, equal the value of liabilities, interest-bearing liabilities, plus the value of equity, which could include preferred equity, but we're not going to. So if we run this through, we came up with a value of operations of 2,500 mil. We came up with a value of non-operating assets that was marketable securities or short-term investments of 37 mil. Notes payable 110 mil, long-term debt 754, and our company has no preferred stock. We're left with an algebraic equation with one unknown. So we solve. And we find the value of all the company's equity based on our corporate valuation model is $1673 million. That's what we think MD's stock in total is worth. Final step, divide by the number of shares. And we come up with a value of the equity per share. So based on the corporate valuation model, this is what we think the MD stock is worth. This is the intrinsic value. If we're thinking about buying the stock, we don't want to pay any more than $33.46, and obviously we'd like to buy it for a lot less. But this is how the corporate valuation model comes up with the value for the stock. I didn't plan on it, but just for grins, let's try another one on the side. Let's say we've got golly. Let's say we've got Zumba Corporation. You with me on this so far? Free cash flow for the year just ended was 50 mil. We pull out our crystal ball, we look into the future, and we think this free cash flow will grow at a 5% rate forever. And our cost of capital, 10%. Well, I want this right. There we go. So, what would be the value of operating assets or operations for our company? Well, to get the free cash flow in the coming year, we take what it was for the year just ended times 1 plus the growth rate. So 50 mil times 1 plus 5% would be $52.5 million. Sorry, 1 second. What am I using? Blue? Pen. So 52.5 mil divided by a cost of capital of 10% minus our projected growth rate. And we would come up with the value of operations for this company of 1,050 mil. Now let's assume we have the following additional information. Our company has short-term investments, marketable securities of 100 mil. It's got notes payable of 200 mil. And bond debt, long-term debt, of 500 mil. Using the corporate valuation model, our next step, once we've got the value of operations, we'd run this through the balance sheet equation. The value of operating assets plus the value of non-operating assets would be equal to the value of interest-bearing debt plus the value of equity. We won't worry about preferred equity. So we found the value of operations to be 1,050. Short-term investments or marketable securities are worth another 100. Our interest-bearing debt totals 700. So if we solve, we'd find the value of equity is, can't even do that in my head. 450. That's what we think all the shares are worth. Now, what if this company has what if this company has, I don't know, 50 million shares of stock? Then what would be our estimate for the value of the stock per share? We think all the shares are worth 450 mil. And we now know there are 50 million shares. I think that works out to $9 per share, does it not? You guys still there?
It is $9 a share.
Okay. I have a really silly request. Would everybody just say hi?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Cool. Okay, I'm not alone.
Drinking beer flu.
It got so quiet. Okay, now, sometimes, that's where I wanted to go. Sometimes we have the case where free cash flow doesn't grow at a constant rate. For instance, we might have a company, here we go, that's jumped into a new hot arena. And we're expecting free cash flow to grow by leaps and bounds for a couple of years, maybe jump to 450,000 in the coming year, 650 the next year. And then once competition comes in and erodes our profit margins, our free cash flow will settle down into a constant 6% growth rate from then on. Now, even though we're not looking at a constant growth rate out of the gate, we can still use the constant growth model to help us out. We're looking at free cash flow in the coming year, the next year, the next year, the next year. Somebody stop me. All right. in our problem, we're given that free cash flow in the coming year is 450. Then in the second year from now, we're forecasting it to jump to 650. May I make one correction? I apologize for this. I see a mistake I made with zeros. Let's knock out those zeros and call those mil. All right?
All right.
Free cash flow in the coming year is expected to be 450 mil. Then the following year, 650 mil. All right. So after then, it's expected to grow at a constant, what did I say, 6% rate. So technically, I could find free cash flow for year 3 is 650 times 1.06. Bear with me on this. That'd be wrong. 650 times 1.06. 689. Then in the next year, it'd grow by another 6%. That'd be roughly 730. And so on. Are you with me on this so far?
Yes, sir.
Now, here is the interesting thing. If at any point in time, you can look into the future and see a constant growth rate from that point on, you can discount all those remaining free cash flows back to that point in the future. For instance, let me get this out of the way. If we stood 2 years from now and we looked into the future, from this point on, we're looking at a constant 6% growth rate. Now, technically, the value of operations in any year T, if from that point forward you're looking at a constant growth rate, that could be found by taking the free cash flow in the next year divided by WACC minus that constant growth rate in free cash flow. So if I did what you see in a lot of movies where you flash forward, flash back, 2 years from now, when I look into the future, I see a constant growth rate from then on. So I could find, let me get this little thing out of the way. I could find the value of operations in year 2 by taking the free cash flow in the following year, which would be free cash flow in year 2 times 1 plus that growth rate. Was that 650 times 1.06? That'd be our 689, wouldn't it? divided by our cost of capital, which was 24%, minus that constant growth rate. And that would give us, I'm going to round it, okay, 3828 mil. Now, what is that? Your author calls this the so-called horizon value. But what it actually is, it's, how to do that? It's an expression of the value of all free cash flow beyond year 2 in year $2. So if I put 3828 as the value of operations at the end of year 2, that is the value of all free cash flow beyond year 2, discounted back to a single lump in year $2, then this is an expression of all future free cash flow. Two years of free cash flow, and then the value of all free cash flow beyond year 2 expressed as a single lump in year $2. If I then wanted to find the value of operations now, it would simply be the present value of those free cash flow figures. I could show it to you algebraically. I think it'd make you sick. If you used your calculator, notice that gives us total free cash flow in year 1 of 450, and in year 2 of, what is that, 4478. All I need to do to get the value of operations at time 0 is to discount these two future free cash flows back to year 0. Algebraically, we take the free cash flow in year 1, discount it back at our cost of capital for 1 year, and then the free cash flow in year 2, discount it back at our cost of capital for 2 years. And that would give us a value of operations right now, and I'm rounding, 3470. This is how you would approach a problem where free cash flow grows at unusual rates for 2 or 3 years and then settles down into a constant growth rate. In this case, we've got 2 years of free cash flow where it's not growing at a constant growth rate. And then after then, it grows at a 6% growth rate. So we first calculate what's called the horizon value. We use this fairly nifty little formula to discount all the free cash flow beyond year 2 back to a single lump in year 2 dollars. And then we've got an expression of all the future free cash flow consisting of these three numbers: 450, then 650 plus 3828. Discount that back to the present, and that's the present value of all future free cash flow. If you don't like to do it algebraically, you can use your calculator. You have a CF key, and its purpose is to help you find the present value of free cash flow that doesn't grow at a constant rate, uneven free cash flow. There's our 450, and there is our, I rounded that to 4778, I think. Here's our discount rate, and here's what it gives us. I'm almost afraid to ask, how many of you have used the CF key with your calculator? Any of you? Good. These are the keystrokes for the HP10B2. If you happen to have, how many of you have a, by voice, I don't have my gallery view, by voice, how many of you have a BA2 Plus? Anybody?
I do.
I do.
Okay. So if we,
The rest of the class.
continues. If we did this with the BA2 Plus, these would be our keystrokes. We'd hit CF, Shift, Clear. By the way, the CF key, that's just a single column spreadsheet. First, you reset all the cells equal to 0, so some older numbers don't come back to haunt you. Then it will prompt you for the cash flow at time 0. There's not one. So you can just hit 0, enter, down arrow. Then it will prompt you for the cash flow in year 1, which in our case is 450. Hit enter, down arrow. Then it will prompt you for the frequency of that number. In other words, how many times do you have the 450 in a row? By default, it sets it equal to 1. So you can just hit the down arrow again. Then it prompts you for the next cash flow, which would be 47. Guys, I'm going to round, okay? 78. Hit enter. And you've got all your future cash flows in there. So now you would hit the NPV key. It'll prompt you for the value of I, your discount rate. You'd put 24, enter, down arrow, and then compute. That also should give you approximately 3470. I rounded a little bit, so the answer would be a little off. How many of you are getting that with your BA2 Plus?
I am.
Cool. By the way, we did the same thing with the HP10B2 when we were using it. This thing. That one there. Notice if you hit Shift and clear all with your HP10B2, You then start throwing values into the CF key, but the first one is, it assumes is a cash flow at time zero. There's not one. So you had to throw 0 in first. Are you with me on this so far? I know it's a mess. But if you have free cash flow growing at an uneven rate, like you do in this problem, like you do in your case, we're going to look at it in just a second. Then this is the approach. You have to calculate a horizon value, then discount those free cash flow back to the present to get the value of operations at t equals 0. How about that? I didn't have those in there. I didn't know I did. And we all got a value of operations of 34.7. That's the value of operations now. Next step, run through the balance sheet equation. For our company, we've got short-term investments of 37, or marketable securities at 37 mil. Really, this is the same problem I started you with, but with this problem I started you with, we had a constant growth rate of free cash flow right out of the gate. Then I switched you to this messier problem where we had free cash flow growing at an odd rate for a couple of years, then settling into a constant rate. But now we go back to that balance sheet equation, same thing we had before, only now instead of plugging in the earlier we had a value of operations of sorry, 2,500, right? That was assuming free cash flow grew at a constant rate of 6%. But then we changed up the problem where the free cash flow grew in big jumps for a couple of years before it settled in to that 6%. And of course, if it grows at a higher rate for a couple of years, you find the value of those operating assets are worth more. But we follow through just like we did earlier, run it through the balance sheet equation to get the value of equity, then step it down to per share. And we get a value of the stock of nearly $53 a share. That's what we think it's worth. We went through this whole valuation process to determine what we think the stock's worth. If we can buy it for 40 bucks a share, we jump on it if we have confidence in our valuation. It is a lot to absorb. Now, in this problem, we had free cash flow grow at an odd rate for a couple of years, right? And when we found our horizon value, it was for 2 years from now. So then to find the I lost my PowerPoint show. Well, no matter. All right. We found the value of, all right, I'll do it this way. Hang on. We had free cash flow that grew at an odd rate for 2 years, then a constant rate. So we found the horizon value, which was the value of operations 2 years from now, or another way to say it, the value of all free cash flow beyond year 2, discounted back to year $2. Then when we looked at our free cash flow, it was 450, 650, and then this horizon value. And we discounted those free cash flow back to the present, to get the value of operations at time 0. In your case, your free cash flow grows at an odd rate for 3 years. Sorry about the small font. There we go. I'll tell you what, guys, it's an adjustment for me. There we go. To get used to this tablet. But in your case, it's the end of 2019. And these are your forecasts for the next 3 years. And what you have to do, there we go. For each year, you have to calculate the value of net operating working capital, then the value of operations, and then free cash flow. So for the first 3 years, instead of 450 and 650, you have these 3 figures. And notice the first one's negative. That's okay. Then you have to calculate the horizon value. And the horizon value will be found by taking the free cash flow really for 2022. I'm compacting those earlier 2 steps into one, times 1 plus that constant growth rate, divided by the cost of capital, minus that growth rate. And that actually will be the value of all free cash flow beyond 2022, discounted back into a single lump in 2022 dollars. So then your final step to get the value of operations anyway, you've got free cash flow in the first year of a negative 288. In the next year, 743. In the next year, I'm rounding, guys, 818. And then the value of operations is the value of all free cash flow beyond year 3, discounted back in a single lump in year $3. So you end up with 3 free cash flow figures. You use the CF key of your calculator if you're doing this by hand to come up with the value of operating assets at t equals 0. Then you run it through the balance sheet equation to get the value of equity and then the value of equity per share. Your case is messier than that little problem I just gave you, because you have to go back to those chapter 2 formulas and calculate net operating working capital to get free cash flow. And instead of 2 years of free cash flow, you got 3. But then it grows at a constant rate after 2022. That's given in the case. In fact, I think that constant rate of growth, I've probably got it up here at the top. Yeah, there we go. That constant rate of growth after 2022 is 5%. And I also made it a little bit messier to where you use some of the stuff from your cost of capital chapter. You use the risk-free rate and the return on an average stock to come up with the stockholders' required rate of return. Then you find the WACC, which is the wait for debt times the after-tax cost of debt, plus the wait for equity times the cost of equity. We use the CAPM to come up with the cost of equity. You're given the interest rate on debt for the company somewhere in there. Oh, I didn't go high enough, did I? Or did I? Yep. There's your interest rate on debt. You're given your tax rate. So you have to calculate the WACC. Go to a little trouble to calculate the WACC that you then apply to those future free cash flow. To eventually come to the value of operating assets, then the value of equity, and then the value of equity per share. Tonight's warm-up may be more disturbing to you than the other ones. The corporate valuation model is a little bit messy, but it actually makes a lot of sense. Do you have any questions?
You said that on the free, I can't really see it, but on the Excel document, there's the -2 in your writing, -288,
Yep.
743.
You have to keep track of that negative sign.
Right. So there's 4 numbers there as our future cash flows.
Yep.
But you said that we use 3 numbers. You say you put 3 circles.
Well, what you've got, sorry, let me get this going here. What you've got is 3 years of free cash flow. And then you've got a 4th number, which is called a horizon value. And that's the value of all free cash flow beyond year 3.
Okay.
So really, these 4 numbers represent all future free cash flow.
Okay. And can you remind me why you put the 3 circles there and you said you used 3 numbers?
Well, the last 2 occur in the same year, so we can just add them. I mean, this would be a -288, 743, and then what do you get? 16, what is it? That would be 17,649.
Okay.
And these are the 3 that you'd put in your CF key in your calculator if you were doing it by hand.
So since we're doing it in Excel, do we just need to find what formula they use for CF?
Well, you need to, you put in the formula for free cash flow. And since you're trying to discount these free cash flow back to the present, you could just use the NPV function.
Can you write that? You said NPV. NPV.
Yeah.
Okay, the function.
Yeah, you could have, for example, in a cell somewhere, equals NPV. You refer to the cell that has the cost of capital, which is one of your outputs. Nope, there it is. Cell B90, right? Now, the NPV function in all spreadsheets is misleading. It actually finds the present value of future free cash flow. So I'd specify the cell range, what? B87 through D87. That would find the present value of the future free cash flow. Well, actually, those are all future values, so that's good. And then we've got that horizon value. And I mean, one way you could do it is just algebraically. You could tell it to take the value in cell, what, B91, divide by 1 plus your cost of capital, discounted back how many years?
Three.
Say again.
3.
3. There you go. Perfect. Wait a minute. I'm working out the spreadsheet for you.
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've gone far enough, you guys. But there's a lot of little tricky things. Once you work through this, you'll get comfortable with it. I don't lose any students on the corporate valuation model. Clearly the messiest of all your spreadsheets so far. Yeah, who asked me for that? Caitlin, was that you? That was
Yes,
a good
sir.
bait.
No, you kept saying, well, if you were doing it by hand, you would just plug it into the calculator. So I was just trying to figure out how on earth we would plug it into Excel since we
Right.
aren't using a calculator.
So this gives you an awful lot of hints on how to set up your Excel spreadsheet. And for your case quiz, we looked at how you would work it with a calculator, with your CF key and your calculator.
Okay, got that. So for the actual quiz, we would use the calculator. Okay. Do it by hand.
In fact, if we had this problem and we're trying to find the value using our calculator, let's say what do you more of you have? The BA2 plus, the HP 10B2. How many of you have the BA2 plus by, I don't know, say something. How many of you have the BA2 plus?
I do.
I have one.
I
How
do.
many of you have the HP 10B2?
Me.
Me too.
Okay. Well, you're outnumbered. So if it were the BA2, oh, okay. Well, still.
There's the B2 Plus app.
Wow, how did I do that? All right. If you were used to BA2 plus, you'd hit CF shift clear. It would prompt you for a cash flow at time 0. There's not one. So you'd put 0, enter, down arrow. Then you'd put the 288 in, but you need to make it negative, and the calculators are funny. You'd have to hit 288 and then the plus minus key to make it negative. Then enter, down arrow twice, then 743, which is a positive value. What happened? It's close. Enter, down arrow twice because it only happens once. Then that total, 17,649. Enter. Now you got all those cash flows in. With this calculator, you'd hit NPV. It'd prompt you for the cost of capital, which was 10.1%. Enter, down arrow, compute. And it ought to give you the value of operations. Because you're calculating the present value of free cash flow, and that gives you the value of operations. Any other questions? Hang in there. Once you start working with this, you'll get more comfortable with it. But it is the messiest of the spreadsheet assignments, and in a way, the messiest of the case assignments. But you don't want it easy anyway, do you? Any questions? That's all I have for tonight. That's enough. If you don't have any other questions, I'll end the meeting. Going once, going twice. I'm not hearing any questions.
I think we're all just in a little,
Son,
Overwhelmed.
little overwhelmed state. Don't really know where to start.
I know, but it will sink in and you'll get comfortable with it.
we should Zoom again on Thursday. I may have questions by Thursday.
True.
I thought about doing multiple Zooms, but you know what? That's overkill. I think by Thursday, if you have questions, what should you do?
Email.
You
Post
can
it.
either you can email, you can write them out by hand, you can try working something out by hand, take a picture and send it to me, or just email me. All right, guys, I'm going to end the session, okay?
All right.
Thanks, Dr. Cudd.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys have a good week.
You too.
You too.
Whew.
Oh my gosh.
And I can still hear everybody. The meeting quit recording. Yeah, it's slowly knocking you guys out. Okay, stop the recording. Okay, let's see, how do I get out of this? I did end the meeting for